This is History for the Reckoning, a podcast that dives deep into the history that's hard to hear but critical to understand. Season 1, American Concentration Camps, the story of World War II Japanese incarceration. Okay, listeners, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Ford. Last time we talked about the period between Pearl Harbor and the entering of the Japanese Americans from the West Coast into the concentration camps. And today we'll be talking about the camps themselves, specifically the huge WRA camps, or War Relocation Authority camps, where most of the West Coast Japanese were incarcerated during the war. Helping us with that today, we have an incredible guest, Chizu Omori. Chizu is a community activist that has been involved in civil rights work for an incredibly long time, done some really amazing things. Where I first became aware of her was because of an incredible documentary that she was a part of that's called Rabbit in the Moon. What's particularly special about Chizu coming on today for this topic is that Chizu is herself a survivor, someone who was in one of these camps and has first-person knowledge of exactly what happened there and can tell us about it. Chizu, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're an amazing example of someone who's willing to share her story. That's not particularly common for these very traumatic things. So first off, thank you for doing that and your history of doing that. It's been really inspiring.
Well, you know, I'm 95 years old, and what have I got to lose by talking about some history?
What are we going to do now? So I mentioned that you are a survivor from one of these camps. So I'd love to just start with the basics there. So how old were you? Which camp was it? How long were you there?
Okay. I was between the ages of 12 and 15 while I was in the camps. My family went from San Diego County to Poston, Arizona. Our experience was somewhat different from the experience of many others because one thing was we did not go to an assembly center. Most everybody else went to a holding center while the camps were being built. Yeah. And so they had the experience of being in racetracks and fairgrounds and all kinds of temporary places. I think that because our family dodged that experience, so we really didn't. We just went to Poston and just stayed there the whole time. Now, other families were shuffled around a lot, but we were not. So I think in many ways, my family did not undergo many of the real hardships that some of the other families did. Yeah. And I just was kind of counting up, why was that so? Just the luck of the throw of the dice or whatever. We happened to go to Poston. The camp was run in a more benevolent fashion than other camps. The administrator came out of the Indian service. So I don't know. I think he was just sort of more easygoing and more sympathetic towards us. That was my feeling. And for instance, we did not have barbed wire and guard towers around our camp. I understand that they were going to put those up, and the administrator, his name was Wade Head, said, where can they go? They can't go anywhere. We don't really need a fence. So just that in itself, I think, made a difference. I think if we had had a fence around the place where we knew that we couldn't go beyond the fence, and if we knew that there were guard towers up with soldiers with machine guns or whatever they had, it would have created a much more prison-like atmosphere, I think, whereas we really roamed around. I remember as a kid there just going as far as we wanted to or whatever and go to visit the Colorado River and things like that. And then a whole bunch of other reasons too. But anyway, I think our family was lucky in some ways.
You mentioned that the camp director, the camp administrator there said, "Where
Mhm.
are they going to go? There's no place to
Mhm.
go." So I wonder if you can tell us, just in general, where were the WRA camps? How many of them were there? Where were they?
The
Mm.
major camps were 10 in number,
Okay.
scattered all over the United States, pretty anyway, in different states. Most states only had one camp. Say, I think
Hmm.
California had Manzanar and Tule Lake. They had
Yeah.
two. Jerome and Rower were two in Arkansas, but the others, Poston was in Arizona. You know, let's see. Well, I don't know if I can name them right off the
You don't
top of
have to.
my
Don't
head.
worry about it.
Manzanar, Amachi, and Amachi was in Colorado. Minidoka was in Idaho. Anyway, they were really scattered all over. And as a kid, I didn't know all this because how would I know? Or,
No.
so in a way, we were all pretty isolated. And, to have lived in one place like that for 3.5 years, well, anyway, it was later that I really understood the scope of the government's programs and things.
So I
Hmm.
wonder if you could tell us what day one was like, both for you and then just typically when the train pulls up or the trucks pull in or the buses pull up and people arrive at camp. What's what's it like? What do they see? What do they experience?
Well, um, where we were, I mean, I'm just going to talk about, what I remember.
Yeah.
It was obviously a kind of a desert-like area, and what they had done was just taken bulldozers and just scraped off any vegetation that was on there. So
Mm.
they built the barracks just directly on that loose soil. So um, when we got there, our camp was not finished yet.
Oh
So
no.
uh, yeah, and everything was pretty raw, um, and the dust was just terrible because there was nothing to hold it down. Um,
Mm.
so and it was so hot. Um, Arizona summers are, over 100 degrees most every day, and
Oh.
so that first summer was just trying to survive in that heat, trying to cool off and trying to,
Right.
you know,
And
uh,
most of
get
y'all would
through.
have been from California, so these
Yeah,
places
pretty
where
much. Yeah.
temperature was very mild.
Hmm. It was a large camp, but our camp was, like just 10,000 people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
10,000 is
And
a sizable town.
yeah, a real, sort of a community. Uh, and on an Indian reservation, it turned out.
Oh.
When we got there, like I said, it was very raw. And honestly, I think we were just trying to keep clean and, uh, trying to keep the dust out of our barracks and trying to survive the daytime heat, and getting used to that communal style of living, of going into a mess hall 3 times a day to eat. And uh, the blocks, they had the barracks arranged in blocks. So
Hmm.
each block was, I don't know, maybe a dozen barracks with a latrine for women and for men, and then a wash area, with tubs for washing clothes and stuff. And then
Hmm.
the mess hall would be in one corner, and so we would all eat together 3 times a day. And it just was a big shock to be living in that style of life where there was very little privacy,
Oh, yeah.
and it was this unusual community where nothing was normal. That is to say, everyday life was regimented by the meal times, and uh, other camps or assembly centers. I know that they were called out and had to stand in line and be counted and all that. Well, they didn't quite do all that in our camp, but just getting to know people. What they did was put 5 persons per room. the
Okay.
barrack was divided into like four, and so um, it just depended on the size of your family, how many rooms you got. And in some cases, I know that, like one room would be filled with maybe three young couples with no children or something. But, it's sort of like there you are stuffed in with strangers and
Yeah.
just having to accommodate your daily living with total strangers. So everybody went around hanging up sheets and whatever they could to kind of get a little separation in their
Sure, a little privacy.
quarters. And, you know, it just was surreal, I guess. And people were no longer anchored to everyday activities. Like you didn't go grocery shopping or, you
Right.
know, cooking and cleaning and all that. And the mess halls, I mean, wow, yeah, communal eating. So we'd all be in line. And so it got so that you didn't have to eat with your family. I mean, maybe some people insisted, but anyway, we could just, load our plates and sit down anywhere. And what what resulted was kids were forming their peer group gangs, you
Mm.
might say. And so you
Right.
started doing everything, with your friends. And so maybe I just kind of remember you could leave your barrack and not, show up until you go to bed because you'd just be out there playing with your friends or running around the camp and eating. In fact, we would go to other mess halls to sneak in and eat at other places. So um, and a lot of effort was put into making our rooms somewhat livable with furniture. People are actually making furniture out of scrap wood and uh, uh, just, I think we found uh, the catalog, Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. People
Yeah.
just started ordering stuff like, say curtain material or whatever, and just tried to make as homey an environment as you could under the circumstances. But for kids, it was kind of exciting because we were kind of out from under our parental control to a large degree. I mean, running around and um, finding and making friends. School didn't start till the fall, so when they decided that they needed schools, they just appropriated rooms out of the barracks to be school rooms. Yeah, and they were pretty primitive at the beginning, but sort of semblances of normality, or got organized. Churches again using rooms within the barracks as
Mm.
uh, rooms to have services and all that. So I remember having grown up on a farm, we didn't go to church. My family was not very religious, so I had no church background. So, like we could go to all these different Christian churches and Buddhist churches. I just remember going to all of these different kinds of activities going on. So, in a way, it was bringing together all these um, Japanese Americans and, rural or urban, um, all kinds of classes. I mean, well-to-do people and very poor people, and we were all kind of stuck together, having to make do with what we had at that place. So, but I don't know if you know Japanese American communities, but they get organized, and so honestly, immediately there were churches. It seemed like, and other social activities. Time was something that people had so much of. I mean, if you're freed from a job, from well, you can clean your room, but that was it, and you didn't really have to. Uh, in fact, you didn't have to mind your kids because you knew they couldn't go very far. So
Right.
people, it just was a odd experience because daily life was so regimented. Uh, the parents kind of slowly lost control over their children. Um, uh, like I say, you could just go out of the barrack and not come back until it's time to go to bed. So anyway, um, people didn't kids didn't really have to eat with their parents. They were with their peer groups pretty much and all. And so there was family, um what should I say? Of course, and then of course the Japanese family, which I grew up in, very old-fashioned, kind of patriarchal and all that sort of thing. Well, then there, the family structure really broke down because the fathers really lost control. They were no longer the breadwinners. They, um,
Right.
a lot of them are just bitter old men who I used to just see them sitting around, um, complaining a great deal of the time and, maybe playing board games and stuff. And um, there were jobs, but, they were paid so little that I knew some of these old men. They just decided it wasn't worth working because they were paid so little. So I don't know. They just had to.
Mhm.
I don't know what they did with their time, but like our camp, at least you could go leave the camp. You could go out and walk around. I remember there was a little creek that ran close by the camps, and we devised fishing gear, and we went and we would catch little bass and catfish and things like that. I mean, there's just, was a lot of stuff like that to do. Going to the Colorado River. Once school started, then that kind of imposed more order on our the children's daily lives. So we had teachers who came from outside of camp, white teachers who came, and many of them were like Quakers or people who were do-gooders, if I could use that term. So they were nice people, and I just remember that school was one thing I really looked forward to, because I was always a good student anyway. So yeah, and they had libraries. There were a lot of donated books and stuff. So I remember hanging out at the library. Um, uh, and then all these social groups, and then they would have dances and parties for the older teenagers and such, and my mother never wanted me to go to any of those things. She didn't want us to grow up too fast. And anyway, she was very disapproving of mixing with all these urban kids, and the boys with their pachuco haircuts and clothing. And anyway, there just
Yeah.
was a lot going on. Also, like showering all together, um, and like until they put up partitions, the toilets were all exposed, so we were all sitting in a row on the toilet. Just things like that, which um, our community really had a hard time getting used to because they're really rather modest, you know, retiring types. That's our culture, and so to be so exposed in that way was difficult for a lot of people.
How was the food in camp?
Well, um, I tell you, it was real institutional food, and uh, we Japanese were used to fresh fish and vegetables and fruit and stuff, especially from California, and just reduced to mostly canned goods and uh, institutional cooking and all that. It just became, I hardly remember what we ate in camp because I think we just ate to stay alive.
Sure.
I remember Vienna sausages, which are little sausages
Yeah.
in pans, and um, I remember things like opening a package of fig Newtons, the dried fig cookie like thing, the fig,
Yeah.
yeah, and it was just full of bugs and weasels.
I know.
I could never eat another fig Newton again. So, it was pretty institutional food, a lot of bologna and um, uh, after a while, they did start farms where it was feasible within the camps, and we started growing vegetables. And gee, I've seen pictures of Tule Lake, other places. They had chickens and pigs and uh, even cattle. Um, anyway, uh, I only found out about all this stuff afterwards. But so, the food got better as they uh, could provide more of it themselves.
Sure. So
Yeah,
that's these incarcerees, these people who had been put in this concentration camp, made their own farm and started
yeah,
feeding
because there
their
are a
own
lot of
population.
farmers. There are a lot of farmers. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. We built apparently canals to bring water to the land, and I said, started growing food and everything. And so when we left, the land was turned over to the Indian tribes that were around there. So
Hmm.
they're now very prosperous farmers because of the canals and all that were built by the Japanese while we were there. Honestly, I was not aware that there were 10 big camps, in the rest of the
Sure.
country. Um, I knew that my grandparents were in a different camp, and I guess there was some correspondence or something, but I I don't remember that my mother reading letters from them or anything. So it felt like we were quite isolated and cut off from the outside world. I was very fortunate in that I had a kind of level-headed father,
Hmm.
and he was a very calming influence. And I know that there were other families where being on the trains going into the camps, they thought they were all being taken to be shot and killed someplace.
Sure.
And I heard, stories about people saying, don't eat these lunches, the box lunches that they pass out. We don't know if they're poisoned or not. I mean,
Oh.
one responds to situations in a very different sort of way, depending on how paranoid you are or whatever. And
Yeah.
anyway, so um, personally, I really didn't wonder too much about what it all was. It just was like an exciting new experience being with so many different kinds of people, and you just
Hmm.
you found others who um, that you shared interests with or whatever. I think and the parents really tried hard to make life more normal than in any way they could. Uh, Classes were organized, social groups, sports activities. Women had sewing circles, and I know that there were old folks, who were interested in Japanese singing of various kinds. I mean, whatever activity or interest, people would form their own, little groups and kind of spend their time um, learning things or uh, uh, I don't know, various social activities. Now you got to remember that at the very beginning of the war, um, December 7th, the FBI came up came to our communities and rounded up about 2,000 of the men folk. They were
Mm.
taken to Department of Justice. Um, these were real, camps for enemy aliens and all that. So there were many families in the community where the breadwinner was just snatched up. And
Oh, sure.
in some cases, they never heard from them again. I've heard of several like that. But
Oh, wow.
anyway, they didn't know where they had gone, didn't, didn't have any contact. Many families didn't for a while. So my family luckily didn't have that experience that my father was not picked up. And when I think about Issei women, these immigrant women who didn't speak English and, were raising families, that suddenly they had to cope with everything that was happening without their husbands, without the fathers, and, trying to keep the families fed and going. And I think bank accounts were frozen sometimes and they couldn't even have access to their money. Curfew was put on the communities. So some families had I can understand how they had a very rough time, that
Yeah.
these women, but they had to cope with it and settle the family business, whatever it was, and take all their children and be put on trains and buses and sent off to camps. So, when I say I'm lucky, there are many things that happened to a lot of other families that didn't happen to my family.
You mentioned how the camp you were in didn't have the barbed wire, didn't have the
Yeah.
guard towers. I wonder if, from your research and talking with other survivors, if you could describe the experience of being in a camp that did have barbed wire and guard towers.
Well, for instance, there were at least 7 killings of inmates in the camps by
Oh.
guards, soldiers. Yes. Uh, and so, of course, I think once somebody was killed by a guard, I'm thinking about Mr. Wakasa at Topaz particularly.
Mm-hmm.
He was walking his dog and was killed. That Can you imagine how frightened everybody must have been to hear that?
Right.
This guy was just walking, taking a walk, and who there weren't witnesses to say exactly what had happened, but who knows what the guard was thinking? Some kind of trigger happy guy, I guess. That was during the period of the questionnaire when the camp was very tense. That's true.
Mm.
Nevertheless, and the fact that the authorities wouldn't allow them to have a funeral and all sorts of things like that. But anyway, so other people said, gee, they could kill us at will. I mean,
Wow.
if you have to live with that, and and the barbed wire fence is there, I think that you would have a more angry feeling about the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
When
Yeah.
you're more literally in a prison, yeah, you feel like a prisoner.
Yes. Of course, there was unrest in just about all of the camps.
Mm.
So I could go into a whole lot of stories about real conflicts between the administration and the people who were in the camps, and then within the people in the camps having conflicts within the camps. There was a lot going on. There was a group called the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, and it was composed of young Nisei, American-born citizens, and now the government very cleverly cultivated that particular group and got to know them, and would ask them, we would like for you to tell us if there are people in the community, who might be spies or who might who are suspicious characters, and the JACL cooperated with the government and fingered people. And when I look at some of those records, they have to write reports, right? And they get sort of desperate for things to say in their reports, so they'll just
Right.
say just about anything, you know. I'm sure the community knew that this informing was going on. It was not particularly hidden or anything. I think that,
And you're
you
saying
know,
even within the camp, so you've already been incarcerated and the informing was still going on.
yes.
Okay.
And now that, when I think about that, why did they do that? How could anybody be a saboteur in a camp, you know, or, you
Yeah,
know,
in the middle of
and
the Arizona desert, what are they going to do?
yeah, what are they going to do? And so, but they were assigned these jobs, and I think that what you do is you write down gossip and all kinds of things. You know, some people maybe voicing very bitter comments or, you know, anger about being there, or there certainly were people who uh, were supporting Japan because they just felt that the way we're being treated here, we don't want to stay any longer. You know, there was a lot of
Mm,
that kind of stuff. So
right.
those people certainly were considered suspicious. And because of the loyalty questionnaire and all that, you know, they really divided the community that way. But I think that there there was a lot of friction between the JACL, who advocated compliance and showing that you're a patriotic American by agreeing to everything that was asked, you know, that the people had gone
Mm,
through. And we're really loyal. And, you know, we show it by uh, obeying, cooperating, and all of that. And so, you know, there were factions in camp where they thought, oh, those people, they're just sellouts. They just conform, you know, and they take this situation and go along with it, you know, as though it were okay. And certainly among the dissident group, there were pro-Japan people, but there were a lot of just angry people saying, well, we're citizens and where are our rights?
yeah.
And, you know, we're very angry about that kind of thing. So, um, that's why there were riots or, you know, strikes and all kinds of things that went on in the camps because of these different factions, and it became very bitter. No habeas corpus, no nothing. Yeah, so it was so illegal from the beginning that whatever policies that they, you know, put on us were all illegal, you know, more or less, because we shouldn't have been there in the first place. um, and they really, you know, didn't let us. People began trickling out, but it was very slow, and you know, they never really had a good system of letting people out of the camps. There's a lot of red tape. You just had to go through a lot, you know, like you needed a job to go to, you needed a place to stay, and on and on and on. So, you know, you couldn't just say, well, I want to go, I want to leave. You couldn't just do that.
It does seem like that was the point of putting these camps in the middle of nowhere a lot of the time.
Desolate places,
Literally.
yeah, right, yeah, because because we were so dangerous or whatever, yeah, and yeah. um, um, and then, you know, I remember that there was, of course, I didn't know about this until later, that Superman, the comic strip thing, you know, Superman
Okay.
came to visit in a camp. You know, Clark Kent was a reporter, and he came with Lois Lane, who was also a reporter, and they came to write articles about the camps, I guess, you know. And then
What?
while they're in a camp, Lois Lane gets abducted by some bad Japanese, and so Clark Kent has to tear off his clothes and become Superman and rescue her and all that. And this was in a Superman comic strip during the war. I was really not aware that the propaganda about us was so vicious and terrible. Because we were so isolated, we didn't know all that was going on. But apparently, we were considered dangerous people, and so we were the enemy, essentially, to the outside American society. Anyway, but I do remember when the loyalty questionnaire was made mandatory for everybody over age of 17, and I wasn't old enough, so I didn't have to fill out the loyalty questionnaire. And that was used to separate the loyal from the disloyal. And I have studied that whole questionnaire, and it turns out that they really could not define loyalty and disloyalty. Like, I mean, you if you have free speech, you should be able to say things and not be considered that what you said was criminal or something like that, But at any rate, it was a real bludgeon to the community, and they created Tule Lake, this segregation camp for the disloyals, and that made the people who went to Tule Lake pariahs in our community after the war, and it has lingered on. Yeah, it just I don't know. The government, I think they really kind of didn't know what to do with us, so that's why these kind of policies were kind of ad hoc. They just kind of devised them as they went along without really thinking about the consequences of what this policy or that policy might do.
Sure.
And it just caused many families a lot of hardship and a lot of heartache. Yeah.
So after the war, I guess as the war is wrapping up, when they're trying to get people out of the camps, what was your understanding of how that happened?
Well, okay. Now, the thing is, it was really that we were not supposed to go back to the West Coast. The people who left the camp.
Oh.
Yeah, during the war, if you left camp, you had to go east. Anyway, away from the West Coast, because those were military zones, and we were not supposed to be living in those military zones. But they finally opened up the West Coast around December of 1944. This was really before the war ended, and a lot of so people who were still in the camps, once they were allowed to return to the areas where they came from, then they really started emptying the camps and going back to the West Coast, Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle or anyway. But that wasn't allowed until pretty close to the war's end. And my family got stuck in camp because my father had signed repatriation papers that he said he was going to return to Japan. So we got stuck in the camps, and we were there after the war ended. But then my folks changed their minds or something. I heard that they finally communicated with relatives in Japan who said, "Don't come. There's nothing here. We lost the war. People are starving, so don't come." So at that point, I don't really think the government cared whether we were loyal or disloyal or had signed repatriation papers or what. They said, "Well, okay, why don't you just go home or we'll go get out of camp?" So we did.
You had mentioned that some people could leave camp during the war before they were trying to close them down. And I'm afraid our listeners might get the impression that anyone could just leave camp. So I wonder if you could describe how they were given permission and what they were given permission to do.
Well, now there was a program for college students. They allowed a lot of college students to leave camp if they had a school to go to. And many universities refused to take in Japanese American students, but many did. So large group managed to leave camp and continue their education, or or go into college. Yeah. Church groups were active. I think there were always people from the outside church groups, and they tried to help the people as much as they could. Um, and there were labor shortages, so that kind of enabled people, to have negotiate for a job so that they could leave camp. If they had a job waiting for them, they could leave camp. And actually, the WRA had established, like uh, something in a city where they would, you know, help people when they came out, to find a place to live or something like that. And
Okay.
yeah, so they had a program where they were trying to, but it just was cumbersome because you had to. There was an exit questionnaire in which you promised that you would not congregate with other Japanese Americans, and you're not to speak your
Oh,
language, and you know, don't. Um, oh, and uh, also that if you find other Japanese Americans, who had a shortwave radio or something like that, if they had,
mm.
behaved suspiciously, well, you must report them.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that kind of thing. Yeah, to make sure that you were very patriotic and I used to think that, well, the Black experience is really much more terrible than ours were. But on the other hand, this was something that set a precedent on the government level. And people like Trump, I think, would say, well, if Roosevelt did it, so, we could certainly do that. And he is, in a way, from what I'm hearing, building detention centers and things. He wants to deport how many millions of people or something like
Like
that,
11 million people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he certainly would say, well, we've done it before, so um, it's okay to do that. It's legal, or I don't know what kind of word you'd use, but we've done it, so we can do it again. So I think that it's a lesson. It's a lesson that we need to remember. For the country's democratic principles and all that. We need to remember that uh, these are easily uh, overridden when there's panic and where there's a need to scapegoat and um, that kind of thing.
Well, I think that's a lovely sentiment to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Chizu. Thank you for coming on. Season 1 of History for the Reckoning is made possible by support from the JACL Mount Olympus chapter, as well as generous financial support from the Takahashi Family Foundation and the JA Community Foundation. The music was produced by Patrick Coffin. If you want to support the show, follow us on Instagram at History for the Reckoning. Sign up for our newsletter at History for the Reckoning on Substack, where you'll also find the show notes for each episode, or support us financially through Patreon at patreon.com/historyforthereckoning.